Harpers Ferry, WV the sisters who served more than supper. A Macabre history BN YouTube HTPCTTWW YouTube, watch WeTV Feves Kiev Q6 transcript. Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases recorded in the history of West Virginia. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time at which you're listening to this narration. We're interested in knowing which places and what times of day or night these documented accounts reach. In the Sonardozers in 2-4, in the shadow of the Blue Ridge Mountains, where the Petoke and Shenandoah rivers meet, lies a town whose turbulent history extends beyond John Brown's famous raid. Harpers Ferry, West Virginia, 1896. A time when the whistle of steam engines echoed through the valley, and the Civil War remained a fresh wound in local memory. 1048, it was here in a white clapboard house overlooking the confluence of the rivers that the Blackwood sisters operated what locals called the finest boarding house in the county. Their reputation for hospitality was matched only by the mysterious disappearances that plagued the establishment, disappearances that would not be connected until decades later. Levered County records indicate that between 1892 and 1896, at least 7 travelers who stayed at the Blackwood house were never seen again. Their belongings, however, would occasionally resurface. A pocket watch here, a pair of spectacles there, always in the possession of one of the 3 sisters who ran the establishment. 133. When questioned, they spoke of guests departing early, often before dawn, leaving personal effects behind as payment for outstanding debts. The local sheriff, Thomas Harlow, a cousin of the sisters by marriage, never pursued these matters further. The story of the Blackwood sisters remained buried in courthouse archives until 1953, when Professor James Whitaker of Georgetown University uncovered a series of ledgers during research for his work on post-Civil War commerce in the Shenandoah Valley. What he found led him down a $200 path that would ultimately be sealed by government order in 1968 after his own mysterious disappearance. What follows is the account pieced together from surviving documents, newspaper clippings, and interviews with descendants of those who lived in Harpers Ferry during those 4 fateful years. 231s. The records suggest a tale of isolation, desperation, and the darkest expressions of human need, where hospitality masked calculated malice, and where a good meal often served as the prelude to something far more sinister. The Blackwood family had deep roots in Jefferson County dating back to the early 1800s. Landdeed records from 1823 show that Jeremiah Blackwood, a merchant from Baltimore, purchased 20 acres overlooking the rivers, including the plot where the house would later stand. 304. The deed preserved in county archives describes the property as a superior parcel with commanding views of the river junction and access to the main thoroughfare. Jeremiah's business ledgers, partially preserved in the Jefferson County Historical Society collection, indicate he established a successful dry goods business on Shenandoah Street, importing fine fabrics and household items from eastern cities. 3033. Local church records from St. Peter's Catholic Church show the Blackwoods were prominent members of the congregation, contributing substantially to the construction of a new church building in 1833. Jeremiah's wife, Catherine, is mentioned frequently in Ladies' Auxiliary meeting minutes as organizing charity drives for the poor and hosting social gatherings for prominent families. Co. Fordhausen-Bree. By 1840, tax assessment records show the Blackwoods owned not only their original property and store, but had expanded their holdings to include a small farm outside town and several rental properties along High Street. A business directory published in Baltimore in 1842 listed Jeremiah Blackwood as one of the foremost merchants of the growing river community, whose establishment provides superior goods to the distinguished families of Jefferson County. So for their 3 their son William, born in 1821, was sent east for education, first to a preparatory academy in Philadelphia and then to Harvard College, where alumni records confirm he graduated in 1842. William returned to Harpers Ferry and gradually took over management of the family businesses as his father aged. When Jeremiah died in 1852, William inherited the entirety of the family holdings, which by then represented one of the largest private fortunes in Jefferson County. C.O. 5 and 06 William's marriage to Elizabeth Hollister in 1853 united two prominent local families. The wedding, according to a small notice in the Virginia Free Press, was attended by the most distinguished personages of the region, including representatives of the prominent Washburn, Storr, and Lockwood families. Elizabeth was described as a lady of refined education and considerable personal fortune, having attended the exclusive Troy Female Seminary in New York. CO 5535, the couple established their household in the family home overlooking the rivers, which William had extensively renovated following his father's death. Building permits filed with the county show significant expansions, including the addition of a third floor, expanded kitchen facilities, and modernized plumbing. CO 55 and 56 unusual luxuries for the period. The Blackwoods were by all accounts living the life expected of the regional gentry, hosting dinners, attending church, and participating in the seasonal social rituals of wealthy families. The first of their daughters, Margaret, was born in 1854, followed by Ella Lanner in 1858 and Ruth in 1863. Baptismal records from St. CO 66 and 21. Peters show each child was christened with considerable ceremony, with godparents selected from among the most prominent families in the region. School records indicate the girls received early education from private tutors brought from Baltimore and Philadelphia. Another mark of the family's standing and resources, the Zoo 06 version 43, the Civil War changed everything for the Blackwoods as it did for so many families in the border states. William Blackwood, who had inherited the family properties from his father in 1852, made a fateful decision in April 1861. When Virginia voted to secede from the Union, Jefferson County, which would later become part of West Virginia, was deeply divided. CO 7007 William, educated at northern schools and with significant business interests in Baltimore and Philadelphia, chose to support the Union. Military records show that William Blackwood received a commission as a lieutenant colonel in the 2nd West Virginia Volunteer Infantry in July 1861. His service record was distinguished. He participated in the Shenandoah Valley campaigns under General Sheridan and was wounded at the Battle of Cedar Creek in October 1864. The ZO 7737, letters from William to Elizabeth, preserved in a private collection donated to the West Virginia State Archives in 1947, reveal his internal struggle. I cannot in good conscience support the dissolution of our great republic, though I know my position places you and our dear children in a difficult position among our neighbors. I pray that when this conflict ends, reconciliation will be possible. CO 1805. The letters also reveal that the Blackwood businesses suffered significantly during William's absence. In a letter dated June 1863, he writes, "Your report of the store's declining trade pains me, though I understand that many who once counted themselves our friends now take their custom elsewhere. So 0825, we must endure this trial as we have others, with dignity and patience." By 1864, the situation had worsened. A September letter notes, "I am distressed to hear that the rental properties now stand empty and that you have been forced to dismiss the household staff. Please assure Martha and Joseph that they will be welcome back when circumstances improve." So 8th and 4/8. Harpers Ferry changed hands multiple times during the conflict with both Union and Confederate forces occupying the strategic town. The Blackwood home, due to its prominent location overlooking the rivers, was requisitioned as officers' quarters at various points. A damage claim filed with the federal government in 1866 details extensive damage to the property, including destruction of furniture, defacement of walls, breakage of windows, and theft of household items by troops of both armies. The Zo now 9s and 22, but his homecoming was not the triumphant return he might have expected. Local sentiment had run strongly in favor of the Confederacy, and those who had supported the Union were often treated as traitors. The Blackwood family found themselves social paras in a community they had once helped build. Reverend Samuel Woodson, pastor of the Presbyterian Church the Blackwoods had attended for generations, wrote in his personal journal in September 1865, Zo 951, Colonel Blackwood attended services today for the first time since his return. Several families rose and departed when he entered. His wife appeared distressed, but the colonel himself maintained his dignity. The three daughters sat very still like little statues. One wonders what effect this treatment will have on such young minds. Satundavan one Fuyer, the ostracism continued for years. Business ledgers from an eerie in the period show that local merchants often charged the Blackwoods higher prices or refused to extend credit that was routinely offered to other families of similar standing. Invitations to social events stopped arriving. The once prominent family retreated into increasing isolation. Satensen 36, a diary kept by Harriet Stanton, a neighbor whose family remained on cordial terms with the Blackwoods, provides insight into their deteriorating social position. Took tea with Elizabeth yesterday. The house, once so full of life, and visitors stand silent now. The girls are growing up without proper society or friends their own age. So 1058, Elizabeth confided that they have received no invitations to any of the summer gatherings. The colonel spends his days in his study with his books and his bourbon. One feels the weight of their isolation upon crossing the threshold. Elizabeth Blackwood, the colonel's wife, appears to have suffered most acutely from this isolation. Dr. Theodore Lambert's medical journal from 1872 contains multiple entries regarding her condition. Mrs. Leventon 25B continues to exhibit symptoms of nervous exhaustion and melancholia. She speaks of hearing whispers when in town and believes former friends are conspiring against the family. The colonel reports she has taken to spending entire days in her bedroom with the curtains drawn. Lambert's journal provides a progressive account of Elizabeth's deteriorating mental state. April 1873, Levenson 51. B now refuses to leave the house entirely. Has developed peculiar habits. Insists on checking the locks multiple times each night. Believes neighbors are observing the house from the woods beyond the garden. Has lost considerable weight due to poor appetite. November 1874. Mrs. B's condition continues to worsen. The 12542 now exhibits paranoid delusions regarding the household food. Believes unnamed enemies are attempting to poison the family. Has taken to preparing all meals herself. Despite the fact that this was previously the domain of household staff, the colonel reports she will not allow the daughters to eat anything. 12/5/34 she has not personally prepared and tasted first. February 1875. Most troubling development in Mrs. B's case. She now experiences auditory hallucinations. Voices instructing her to protect her daughters from unnamed threats. Has taken to sleeping outside their bedroom door. Personal hygiene severely neglected, have suggested institutional care, but the colonel refuses to consider it at present. So 1300s by 1876, Elizabeth's condition had deteriorated to the point where home care was no longer possible. Records from Western State Hospital in Staunton, Virginia, confirm her admission on June 12, 1876, with a diagnosis of severe melancholia with paranoid features. The admitting physician noted, patient believes her food is being poisoned by neighbors, shows extreme agitation when served meals, has lost considerable weight due to refusal to eat. So 13732, The hospital's quarterly reports to Colonel Blackwood, copies of which were preserved in Dr. Lambert's files, show little improvement in Elizabeth's condition over time. September 1876. Patient remains withdrawn and suspicious. Accepts only minimal nourishment and must be closely monitored to ensure adequate intake. So 1354 refuses to participate in occupational therapy or social activities. December 1877. Patient has developed ritual behaviors around food consumption. Will only eat after elaborate preparation and inspection of all items. Has accused hospital staff of collusion with unnamed enemies. A 14,000 fixie sedation occasionally required during episodes of extreme agitation. March 1879. No significant improvement. Patient now speaks rarely, even to attending physicians. Continues to express belief that she was committed to prevent her from protecting her daughters from harm. Requests to see her children have become less frequent. Elizabeth remained institutionalized until her death in 1883. So 14Z42 hospital records describe her as withdrawn and uncommunicative throughout her stay. Though nurses noted that she brightened somewhat during infrequent visits from her daughters. The colonel visited only twice in 7 years, claiming that the demands of managing the family properties alone prevented more frequent travel. So 1504's the death certificate lists the cause as general failure of health systems consequent to self-starvation, suggesting that Elizabeth's paranoia about food had ultimately contributed to her death. She was buried in the Blackwood family plot in Harpers Ferry, though funeral records indicate the service was sparsely attended. Another indication of the family's continued social isolation. So 1528, the 3 daughters, Margaret, Eleanor, and Ruth, were left largely to their own devices during these difficult years. School records from Jefferson Academy show all 3 were exceptional students, with Margaret particularly gifted in mathematics and accounting. Her term papers, preserved in Themy's archives, show an unusual focus on financial management and investment strategies, topics rarely pursued by young women of the period. So 1559, Eleanor displayed talent in domestic arts as evidenced by her prize-winning embroidery displayed at the Jefferson County Fair in 1872. The local newspaper described her work as showing exceptional precision and attention to detail with stitches so fine as to be nearly invisible to the naked eye. Her teachers noted her perfectionist tendencies, with one evaluation commenting that Miss Eleanor will unpick and restart her work multiple times until achieving the exact result she desires, showing unusual patience for one so young. 1636, Ruth's aptitude for chemistry was noted by several teachers. An essay written by Ruth at age 13, preserved in the Academy's archives, suggests an unusual interest in the preparation and preservation of food, particularly meats. Titled On Modern Methods of Food Preservation and Their Chemical Foundations. The 1659, the essay displays knowledge well beyond what would be expected of a student her age. Her science instructor added a note, unusually detailed understanding of organic decomposition for a student of her age. Somewhat concerning focus on methods of preserving animal tissue. All 3 girls withdrew from formal education following their mother's hospitalization. 1721, Margaret at 18, Eleanor at 14, and Ruth at just 9 years old. The colonel apparently decided that home education was preferable given the continued social isolation of the family. He hired a series of tutors, though town records indicate none stayed longer than a few months. One such tutor, Miss Caroline Spencer, wrote to a friend in Baltimore in 1879. The 1747, the Blackwood girls are intelligent beyond their years, but there is something disquieting about the household. The youngest especially asks questions that no child should contemplate. The colonel is often absent, and the house maintains a silence that presses upon one's spirits. I shall not renew my contract when the term ends. So 1800, another tutor, James Harrison, lasted only 6 weeks before departing without collecting his final wages. In a letter to the headmaster of his previous school, he explained, "The situation at the Blackwood house is not as represented. The girls, while intellectually capable, display disturbing tendencies." Say 1830. The eldest manages the household accounts with suspicious precision for one her age. The middle child spends hours arranging and rearranging items in the house to achieve some standard of order only she can discern. And the youngest, "I cannot adequately describe my discomfort with her preoccupations." So 1875 she dissects small animals found on the property, claiming scientific interest, but the enthusiasm she displays is most unseemly. The colonel, when present, is either indifferent or inebriated. I could not, in good conscience, continue. For the next 15 years, the Blackwood sisters lived in increasing isolation. Neighbors reported seeing them only at church or during necessary trips to town for supplies. So 1900s, the family's once extensive social circle had contracted to include only a few loyal friends and distant relatives who occasionally visited from out of town. Colonel Blackwood's health began to decline in the late 1880s. Dr. Lambert's journal mentions treating him for respiratory complaints and episodes of confusion and agitation, particularly at night. So 1945, the doctor's notes from 1890 express concern about the colonel's mental state. Patient expresses belief that former Confederate soldiers are plotting to burn his house. Has taken to keeping loaded firearms in every room. Have advised the daughters to secure these weapons, as the colonel's hands shake considerably and he may pose a danger to himself or others. The 2008, a particularly telling entry from November 1890 reads, "Called to the Blackwood house at midnight. The colonel had fired his revolver through the bedroom window, claiming he saw intruders in the garden. No evidence of any such presence. The daughters appeared remarkably calm throughout the incident." So 2007, the eldest, Miss Margaret, explained that such episodes were becoming common and inquired about stronger sedatives than I had previously prescribed. Most curious was the youngest daughter's reaction. She observed the proceedings with what I can only describe as clinical interest, as though studying the progression of her father's deterioration. So 2015, when Colonel Blackwood died in February 1891, the funeral was sparsely attended. The obituary in the Jefferson County Advocate was brief, noting his military service, but little else. No cause of death was specified, though Dr. Lambert's private records indicate failure of the heart, possibly hastened by years of melancholia and excessive consumption of spirits. 2015, a more troubling note appears in Lambert's personal journal, never intended for public view. "Am not entirely satisfied with the circumstances of the colonel's passing. Called to certify death in early morning hours. Body already prepared for burial by the daughters, unusual in itself." Miss Margaret cited the colonel's explicit wishes to avoid unnecessary handling. See 2141, no obvious signs of violence or self-harm, though the daughter's composure was remarkable for those who had just lost their only remaining parent. When I suggested a more thorough examination might be appropriate, Miss Ruth commented that further invasion of father's dignity would serve no purpose, as what's done is done. The phrasing struck me as peculiar. So 2204 have signed the certificate as requested, though certain questions remain. The colonel's death left his daughters in a precarious financial position. Military pension records show that his Union Army pension terminated upon his death. The family's once substantial holdings had dwindled over the years, as the colonel had gradually sold off properties to maintain their lifestyle as business ventures failed. So 2233, by 1891, only the house on the hill and a small amount of savings remained. Bank records from the Harpers Ferry National Bank, uncovered by Professor Whittaker in 1954, show that the Blackwood account contained just 203,742 others at the time of the colonel's death, insufficient to maintain 3 unmarried women for more than a few months in even modest circumstances. So 22,557 yet within a year, regular deposits began to appear, eventually growing to substantial sums that allowed the sisters not only to maintain their household, but to make significant improvements to the property. It was Margaret, the eldest and most practical of the sisters, who proposed converting the family home into a boarding house. So 2317, her letter to the Jefferson County Clerk requesting the appropriate business license dated March 7, 1892 states, "Our location near the railway station and the quality of accommodations we can provide should attract a respectable clientele of travelers requiring temporary lodging. We anticipate primarily serving businessmen and tourists visiting the historical sites of Harpers Ferry." The 23,044. The transformation of the Blackwood home was swift and thorough. Local carpenter Joseph Winters was hired to modify the interior, creating additional bedrooms from the formerly spacious family quarters and improving the plumbing to accommodate paying guests. His invoice, preserved in county records, includes an unusual item: reinforcement of basement ceiling beams and installation of specialized drainage system as per Miss Blackwood's specifications. So 2475, the invoice was significantly higher than typical renovation costs of the period, suggesting extensive modifications beyond standard boarding house requirements. Winters later commented to his apprentice Timothy Hayes about the unusual nature of the basement work. Hayes, interviewed by Professor Whittaker in 1954, recalled, "Mr. 2437 orders, Winters said it was the strangest job he'd ever done. Said Miss Margaret had very specific requirements. Wanted a drain in the floor that connected directly to the river. Wanted hooks in the ceiling, beams that could support substantial weight. Wanted the walls lined with copper sheeting in one section. Said he didn't ask questions because the pay was good, but he never felt right about it." 25-01s, Hayes added a detail that caught Whittaker's attention. "Mr. Winters told me they brought in special equipment from Baltimore, a large cast iron table with channels running to the edges and a drain in the center. Took 4 men to move it into the basement. Miss Margaret said it was for laundry purposes, but Mr. So 25-521, Winter said he'd never seen a laundry table made that way with restraining brackets along the edges, and that particular drainage setup said it reminded him more of equipment he'd seen in a slaughterhouse when he did renovation work for the Shepherd families. Butcher shop in Charlestown. By May 1892, the Blackwood house was open for business. So 25-541, an advertisement in the Baltimore Sun described it as a superior establishment offering clean, comfortable rooms and home, cooked meals of exceptional quality, conveniently located within walking distance of the Harpers Ferry train station. Weekly and monthly rates available for extended stays. Similar advertisements appeared in newspapers in Washington, D.C., Philadelphia, and Richmond, suggesting the sisters were casting a wide net for potential guests. A 2016 lemon. The emphasis in all advertisements was consistent. Exceptional accommodations, superior dining, and the personal attention of the proprietors. One notice in the Philadelphia Inquirer specifically mentioned, particularly well-suited for gentlemen traveling on business who appreciate fine cuisine and attentive service in a home-like setting. A 2060s of 133. The business appeared to thrive immediately. Tax records show a significant increase in the sisters' income during the first year of operation. What's curious, however, is that this financial success came despite relatively few entries in the guest register. According to Professor Whittaker's notes, the register showed an average occupancy rate of only 30%, far too low to account for the reported income. A 27 find unearthed. The discrepancy might be explained by an entry in Margaret Blackwood's private ledger discovered among the materials sealed in 1968. A notation from September 1892 reads, "Have determined that official registration of all guests creates unnecessary documentation. Those selected for special hospitality will be recorded in this private ledger only." So 27723, this arrangement should minimize complications should inquiries arise. Local merchants began to notice the sisters' purchasing patterns almost immediately. Thomas Wilson's grandfather, who owned the general store on High Street, kept meticulous records of the sisters' orders. His ledger shows regular purchases of unusual items, lie in bulk quantities, specialized knives, multiple sets of fine bone china that were regularly replaced in uncharacteristically large amounts of certain spices, particularly those known 2755 to mask other flavors. Wilson shared his grandfather's observations with Professor Whittaker. Granddad said the Blackwood sisters bought more preserving salt than were any family he'd ever seen, even those who were putting up meat for the winter, and they bought it year-round, not just during butchering season. So 2018-17, when he asked Miss Margaret about it once, she just smiled and said they had special preservation needs for their kitchen. The hardware store owned by the Jenkins family supplied another piece of the puzzle. Their sales records show the sisters purchased unusual quantities of locks, chains, and heavy-duty restraints of the type typically used for securing livestock. So 2018-3D knife, when questioned, they explained these items were necessary for securing the basement storage room, where they kept their valuable supplies and family heirlooms. The first documented disappearance connected to the Blackwood house occurred in February 1893, approximately 9 months after the boarding house opened. So 29 Husser's Howard Phillips, a timber merchant from Baltimore, arrived on February 14th for what was intended to be a 3-8 stay while he negotiated purchasing rights to attractive forest in the nearby Blue Ridge. According to the guest register, he checked out on February 17th, having paid his bill in full. Phillips's family, however, reported him missing when he failed to return to Baltimore. The 29th and 24, a telegraph sent to Sheriff Harlow in February 20th asked for any information regarding Phillips's whereabouts. Harlow's reply, preserved in Baltimore Police Archives, stated simply, "Severed. Phillips departed Harpers Ferry by morning train on February 17th. According to boarding house proprietors, no further information available." 2974-7. What makes this case particularly interesting is a notation found in Margaret Blackwood's private ledger discovered by Professor Whittaker among the materials sealed in 1968. The entry for February 17th reads, "Mr. P settled his account in full. Personal effects of adequate quality. A 3007. Ruth particularly pleased with the watch fob. Ella Laner has claimed the leather satchel for conversion to household use." A more disturbing entry follows on February 18th. Ruth's special preparation. Most successful. Guests at dinner commented, specifically on the tenderness of the roast. Ella Laner's new preservation technique appears effective. So 38 and Thurston had no detectable odor or discoloration. We'll continue with this method for future special preparations. The banking records for the Blackwood house show a deposit of a $24,375 on February 18th, significantly more than the standard room and board rate would have generated from a single guest's 3-night stay. This pattern of unexplained financial windfalls following guest disappearances would continue throughout the boarding house's operation. The 32nd, a similar pattern emerged with the disappearance of Edward Cartwright, a land speculator from Philadelphia, in June 1893. Cartwright arrived on June 10th and was recorded as having departed on June 13th. His family reported him missing on June 20th after he failed to return home and missed several important business appointments. So 3121, Sheriff Harlow's investigation consisted of a brief visit to the Blackwood house, where he accepted his cousin's explanation that Mr. Cartwright had mentioned plans to visit properties in the Shenandoah Valley before returning to Philadelphia. No further inquiry was made despite Cartwright's horse and carriage remaining unclaimed at the local livery stable for several weeks. See 31-45 Margaret's ledger entry for June 13th notes, Mr. C account settled. Gold pocket watch of superior quality. Ella finds his walking stick useful for reaching high shelves. Ruth pleased with the quality of his boots, though too large for any of us. A subsequent entry dated June 14th elaborates. A 32-7, Ruth experimenting with new marinade for special preparation. Results excellent. Diners commented that the meat was more flavorful than previous offerings. Must remember, subjects who consume alcohol regularly require additional soaking time to remove bitter undertones. Over the next 3 years, similar entries would appear in Margaret's ledger, always coinciding with guests who were later reported missing. The pattern was consistent. The 3236 businessmen traveling alone, carrying cash with no local connections. They would arrive, stay for 2 or 3 nights, and then supposedly depart early in the morning when no witnesses were present. The sisters' operation continued without raising suspicion, protected by their reputation as respectable spinsters and their family's long-standing, if complicated, position in the community. The 33003, their neighbor to the east, Widow Harrison, later recalled, "Those girls were so quiet, so proper, always nodded politely when passing on the street, kept that house immaculate. You could see the windows shining from across the river. Never would have thought they had it in them." Though there was something about Ruth's eyes that never seemed right to me, too calculating for a woman so young. So 3326, another neighbor, Franklin Myers, whose property adjoined the Blackwood house to the north, told Professor Whittaker, "Sometimes at night I'd hear noises coming from their place. Not like a party or guests talking, more like furniture being moved, heavy things being dragged, and once or twice I could swear I heard a sort of mechanical sound, like a pulley or winch operating, always late at night, well after decent folks were asleep." So 3354, I mentioned it to Sheriff Harlow once, but he said the ladies probably just suffered from insomnia and were rearranging their furniture. Myers added a detail he had previously withheld. "There was one night, must have been the summer of '95, when I was out late, checking on my livestock during a thunderstorm. Saw lights in the Blackwood basement windows, which was unusual at that hour. A 34th lightning flashed, and I caught a glimpse of something through the window that I've tried to forget ever since. Looked like the youngest sister, Ruth, working at some kind of table. She had her back to the window, but I could see she was wearing something like a butcher's apron, all stained dark. There was something on the table in front of her, something large. A 34-738, the lightning stopped, and I couldn't see clearly anymore. Told myself it was just the storm playing tricks on my eyes. Never mentioned it to anyone until now. The Blackwood sisters maintained strict roles within their business. Margaret, the eldest, handled all financial matters and guest registration. Ella Lanner managed the housekeeping and linens, and Ruth, the youngest, maintained complete control over the kitchen and dining room. A 35-705, this division of labor allowed each sister to control her domain with minimal oversight from the others, an arrangement that would later prove significant when authorities attempted to determine individual culpability. Sarah Jenkins, who briefly worked as a maid at the Blackwood house in 1894, provided a rare glimpse into the daily operations. So 35-528, in an interview conducted in 1955, the elderly Jenkins recalled, "Miss Margaret was always at the desk, watching who came and went. She had a way of sizing up the gentlemen as they arrived, looking at their clothes, their luggage, their hands. Some she would greet warmly, others more coolly. The ones she was particularly nice to were always the ones who left early and weren't seen again. A 35s and 5e5 Jenkins continued. Miss Eleanor was in charge of the rooms, very particular about the linens. They had to be perfectly white. Sometimes I'd find stains on sheets or towels, and she'd take them from me immediately, saying she would handle them personally. Never let me near the washing when certain items needed cleaning. 36th and Fix Jenkins also described the peculiar system Eleanor had developed for keeping track of linens. She had this book where she recorded every item, how many times it had been washed, when it had been purchased, when it needed to be replaced. If a sheet or tablecloth had been used for what she called special service, it was marked with a small red thread in the hem. So 3063-7, those items were always washed separately, and Miss Eleanor handled them herself. Most revealing were Jenkins's observations about Ruth Blackwood. Miss Ruth was strangest of all. Wouldn't allow anyone in her kitchen while she was preparing meals. The dishes she served looked and smelled wonderful, but there was something off about some of them. A 36-5e9, a sweetness that didn't belong, or a texture that wasn't quite right. When guests complimented her cooking, she would watch them eating with this intense look. Not pleased exactly, more hungry. Ruth's culinary skills were apparently remarkable. A rare surviving letter from a guest who departed safely, dated August 1894, mentions, "The meals alone are worth the price of lodging." So 37 and 25. Ms. Ruth's roast was unlike any I have tasted, tender beyond imagining, with a flavor both familiar and exotic. When I inquired about her technique, she smiled, and said only that proper preparation is everything, and that patience yields rewards in the kitchen, as in life. I have dined in the finest establishments in New York and Philadelphia, yet find myself craving the dishes served at the Blackwood table. So 37s and 5-5, Jenkins left the Blackwood house after only 3 months of employment. I told Miss Margaret I was needed at home to care for my ailing mother, she explained. The truth was the place made my skin crawl, especially the basement. I was forbidden to go down there, but once I needed to fetch preserves, and Miss Ruth was out. So 3080 winter feed years, the shelves were full of jars, but they didn't contain what you'd expect. I didn't look closely, didn't want to, but what I glimpsed didn't look like any fruit or vegetable I'd ever seen. I left the next day and never went back. As 1896 approached, the pattern of disappearances accelerated. Between January and September of that year, 4 men vanished after staying at the Blackwood house. A 339, local merchants began to notice unusual purchasing patterns that went beyond what they had observed in previous years. Ruth Blackwood's special order placed with Harpers Ferry apothecary in July 1896 was particularly telling. The partial receipt recovered from the apothecary's records lists compounds that had legitimate medicinal uses, but in combination and in certain quantities could produce powerful sedative effects. 39908. The apothecary's notation on the receipt reads, "For treatment of Miss Ruth's continued nervous condition as prescribed." No doctor's prescription was found, and Dr. Lambert's records contain no mention of treating Ruth for any nervous disorder. The apothecary's apprentice, Samuel Cooper, later told Professor Whittaker, Miss Ruth had very specific requirements. So 39s and 33 wanted to know exactly how much of each compound would produce deep relaxation without causing permanent harm. Asked about chemicals that would preserve freshness in meat during summer months. Had an unusual interest in various salts and their effects on human tissue. Always paid in cash, always insisted on discretion. Cooper added a detail that he had previously withheld. A 39-59. Once when preparing her order, I asked about the purpose of a particular compound, potassium bromamide, as it was unusual to request it in such quantities. She looked at me with the coldest eyes I've ever seen and said, "To ensure restful sleep Of course, some require more assistance than others to achieve the proper state of repose. Of 4 hours and 22. The way she said it made my skin crawl. After that, I never questioned her orders again. The sisters' business continued to prosper despite the economic downturn affecting much of the region in the mid-1890s. Bank records show regular deposits, often in cash, well beyond what their documented occupancy rates would suggest. They made several significant purchases during this period, including new kitchen equipment, improved plumbing fixtures, and a specially designed icebox from a manufacturer in Philadelphia that, according to the shipping manifest, was 4·58 constructed to maintain temperatures suitable for extended preservation of perishable materials. As summer faded into autumn, the sisters' activities might have continued unchecked if not for the arrival of a particular guest. On September 18, 1896, the evening train from Baltimore brought a man who signed the guest register as Dr. 41720 Ephraim Samuels, identifying himself as a dental surgeon, relocating to establish a practice in nearby Martinsburg. According to the register, Dr. Samuels paid for a full week's lodging in advance, an amount that would have represented a substantial sum in cash. He was assigned the blue room on the second floor, which overlooked the garden at the rear of the house. The 4104 Ford, the sisters could not have known that this man was not Dr. Samuels. County records later revealed that the real Dr. Ephraim Samuels had died 3 months earlier in Baltimore. The man who arrived at Blackwood House that September evening was James Pinkerton, a private detective hired by the family of Howard Phillips, the businessman who had disappeared in February 1893. The 24208 Pinkerton came to Harpers Ferry after months of investigation that had led him to identify a pattern of disappearances connected to the boarding house. For 3 days, he maintained his cover as Dr. Samuels, taking meals with the sisters and observing their routines. In his personal journal, later recovered from his belongings in Baltimore, he noted, "The eldest speaks little during meals, but observes constantly." A 42936. The middle sister maintains pleasant conversation while watching one's reaction to the food. The youngest serves each dish personally, always waiting until guests take the first bite before retreating to the kitchen. The meals are exceptional, perhaps too much so. There is an unusual aftertaste to the evening wine that I have been careful to only pretend to consume. So 4301 Pinkerton's journal entries grow increasingly concerned over his 3-day stay. Second night, dinner consisted of a roast that Miss Ruth described as locally sourced game. The texture was unusual, not like any venison or rabbit I've encountered. The sisters watched with particular intensity as the other guest, a Mr. 4305 Carrington from Richmond, consumed 2 large portions with evident enjoyment. I claimed a headache and ate sparingly. Mr. Carrington became noticeably drowsy during dessert and was helped to his room by Miss Eleanor. When I inquired after him at breakfast, I was told he had checked out before dawn to catch the early train. So 4346, his final entry, dated September 21, 1896, reads, "Am now certain of my suspicions. Have observed basement windows from garden, unusual equipment visible, metal table with drainage system, large preservation containers along walls, hooks in ceiling with pulley system. Will implement plan tonight, if 4409. If I do not report to Baltimore office by noon tomorrow, Agent Thompson should proceed with contingency arrangements." On the evening of September 21st, Pinkerton enacted his plan to discover what happened to guests who never departed. After dinner, he feigned greater intoxication than usual, slurring his words and having difficulty climbing the stairs to his room. So 4429, the sisters helped him to bed with Margaret, assuring him that a good night's sleep will set everything right. What happened next exists only in Pinkerton's report filed with the Baltimore police and subsequently sealed until its discovery in 1962. According to his account, Pinkerton waited until approximately midnight when he heard footsteps in the hallway. For 4053, his door opened, and in the dim light he observed Margaret and Eleanor entering with what he described as a large canvas sheet, several lengths of rope, and a collection of knives and other implements of a concerning nature. Pinkerton, who had not actually consumed the drugged food or wine, but had discreetly disposed of it, confronted the women. Views 45,037 meters. The confrontation that followed was not recorded in detail as the relevant pages were removed from his report before it was sealed. What is known is that Pinkerton left Harpers Ferry abruptly the following morning and returned to Baltimore, where he filed his report, and then disappeared from historical record entirely. A tantalizing clue to what might have transpired during that confrontation comes from a single paragraph that survived in Pinkerton's report. 45946, when questioned directly about the fate of Mr. Phillips and the others, the elder Miss B exhibited no shame or denial. She stated with perfect composure that waste is a sin and that men of means who travel alone are seldom immediately missed. When I suggested that authorities would be interested in her philosophy, she indicated that her family's connections would prevent any serious inquiry, as had been the case previously. The 4605, the look in her eyes convinced me that removing myself from the premises immediately was the wisest course of action. Even more disturbing is a notation found in a margin of the report, apparently added later by Pinkerton. Miss R appeared in doorway during confrontation, carried large cleaver, smiled in manner most unsettling, suggested I might contribute to the household in ways other than financial. So 4642, elder sister ordered her to return to kitchen. Believe my survival due solely to precaution of informing Baltimore office of my whereabouts and suspicions before arrival. The Pinkerton Detective AY's internal records, partially open to researchers in 1967, contain a curious entry dated September 23, 1896. Agent Pinkerton returned from Harpers Ferry assignment. 4706, submitted written report and verbal briefing. Exhibited unusual agitation. Requested immediate reassignment to Western Territories. Request granted. File sealed by order of senior management. 3 days after Pinkerton's departure, the Jefferson County Advocate published a small notice. The Blackwood sisters have closed their boarding establishment indefinitely due to family matters, requiring their attention elsewhere. 74733 Here's the house stood empty for several months before being sold to a family from Washington, D.C. who reported finding the premises in immaculate condition, as though thoroughly cleaned before departure. Edward Collins, the real estate agent who handled the sale, later recalled, the house was spotless, unnaturally so for a building that had been vacant for months. A 4756's Harpers Ferry investigation suspended by client request following unexplained incident. No dust, no cobwebs. The basement had been completely whitewashed, Florida ceiling, and smelled strongly of lye. The kitchen had all new equipment, perfectly clean pots and pans that looked as though they'd never been used. Most strange was the garden. So 4899, it had been dug up entirely, and the soil replaced with fresh earth. When I asked about this, the neighbor said the sisters had engaged in a flurry of activity just before leaving, working day and night in the garden. Said they'd mentioned something about enriching the soil before departure. Collins added a detail that he had not shared publicly before his interview with Professor Whittaker. So 48C4 winners, the new owners discovered something unusual during renovation several months after moving in. When removing wallpaper in the dining room, they found what appeared to be a ledger or accounting book concealed within the wall. They contacted me, knowing I had handled the sisters' affairs. The book contained entries that made little sense. So 49V03, lists of names with dates and amounts, but also weights and what appeared to be evaluations of quality. Terms like prime, select, and standard appeared next to some names. I advised them to destroy the book, which they did. Some things are better left unexamined, particularly in a house where one must continue to live. 49 and 27, the sisters themselves seemed to vanish. No record of their departure exists in local transportation logs. No forwarding address was filed with the post office. Their substantial account at the Harpers Ferry bank was closed with funds transferred to an institution in Philadelphia under the name Shepherd Sisters Investment Trust. The only possible sighting comes from a porter at the Baltimore train station who reported to police in October 1896 that he had assisted 3 ladies of mature years traveling with an unusual amount of luggage, including several 15-3 large trunks that required 2 men to move, boarding a train to Philadelphia. He recalled them particularly because the youngest had a peculiar intensity to her gaze. That made me uncomfortable, and the middle one insisted on handling certain small cases herself, saying they contained fragile items. A 52-24, the porter's statement, taken as part of the Phillips family's private investigation, includes an unsettling detail. One of the trunks was damaged during loading, and the corner broke open slightly. I noticed a peculiar odor and offered to repair it, but the eldest lady declined most firmly. The 59-45. She positioned herself to block my view of the contents, but I glimpsed what appeared to be glass jars or containers inside, carefully packed in straw. The youngest sister whispered something to her that I couldn't hear, and they both looked at me in such a way that I felt it best to complete my duties and remove myself from their presence as quickly as possible. So 5107, for nearly 50 years, the story of the Blackwood House faded from local memory, becoming little more than an occasional reference in discussions of businesses that had once operated in the town. The sisters' departure coincided with a period of economic decline in Harpers Ferry, and more pressing concerns occupied residents' attention. So 5129, the house itself passed through several owners. County records show it was sold 3 times between 1897 and 1923, with each sale occurring after the owners had lived there less than 5 years. A curious pattern emerges in the reasons for these sales. Each family cited a desire to seek opportunities elsewhere or return to relatives in more populous areas. So 51 and 56, none mentioned any specific dissatisfaction with the property. Yet none stayed long enough to establish deep roots in the community. Henry Goodwin, who purchased the house in 1912 and sold it again in 1916, later told his grandson, "Nothing wrong with the house itself. Solid construction, beautiful views, but it never felt right. My wife complained of bad dreams." So 52-721s said she could hear sounds in the walls at night, like something moving or scratching. The children refused to play in the basement, said it smelled wrong and made them feel sick. I'm not a superstitious man, but even I had to admit there was something off about the place. We never discussed it openly, just decided one day it was time to move on. So 52,433. It wasn't until 1953, when Professor James Whittaker began researching commercial enterprises in post-Civil War Jefferson County, that questions about the Blackwood House resurfaced. Whittaker, a meticulous historian with a particular interest in how the war had transformed local economies, stumbled upon the sisters' story almost by accident. So 53-06. Among the documents he discovered in the Jefferson County Courthouse basement was a series of unusual purchase orders from a chemical supply company in Baltimore. The orders, made between 1892 and 1896, listed substances that had no obvious household application, but were known to have sedative properties when administered in small doses. So 53-28, the chemical orders included quantities of chloral hydrate, a sedative that was commonly available in the period, but rarely purchased in bulk by private citizens. Also listed were various preservative compounds, chemicals used in the tanning of leather, and substances that could effectively mask the natural taste of food when added in small amounts. The 53-4 Whitaker's curiosity led him to expand his research. He uncovered the journal kept by Dr. Morris Fletcher, the local physician during the period the boarding house operated. In an entry dated October 1896, shortly after the sisters' departure, Fletcher wrote, "Have examined the basement room at the request of the new owners. A 54-1 Twitter found evidence of extensive cleaning, though traces remain. The drain in the floor shows signs of frequent use. The hooks in the ceiling are not consistent with normal food preparation. I have advised the new owners to seal the room entirely. Some matters are best left undisturbed." A subsequent entry in Fletcher's journal adds, "Mr. So 5400-3005, Collins has consulted me regarding certain stains found beneath the recently removed floorboards in the basement. I have advised him that the discoloration is likely due to mineral deposits from the proximity to the river." This explanation appeared to satisfy him, though I am not convinced of its accuracy. So 5400-377, some questions are better left unasked in a small community such as ours. Most revealing is an entry dated December 1896, apparently written after Fletcher had consumed what he described as perhaps more brandy than is advisable for a man of my years. The more I reflect upon what I observed in the Blackwood basement, the more disturbed I become. So 55-9, the configuration of equipment suggests a purpose I dare not name. The drainage system, the hooks, the table with its channels and collection, basin, all suggest activities that civilized minds refuse to contemplate. And yet I cannot dismiss the correlation between guests who were never seen to depart and the exceptional meals for which the establishment was known. So 55-44, God forgive me for even entertaining such thoughts. This discovery prompted Whitaker to contact descendants of Harpers Ferry residents from the period. Through these interviews, he began to construct a timeline of disappearances that correlated with certain entries in the Blackwood house guest register. Each missing person had been recorded as having paid their bill and departed, always within 3 days of arrival, always after having taken dinner with the sisters. A 50-61 feud, Whitaker's investigation took an unexpected turn when he managed to locate Martha Simmons, whose grandmother had worked as a rest for the Blackwood house. In an interview conducted in 1961, Simmons recalled conversations with her grandmother. She wouldn't talk about it much, but sometimes after a few glasses of blackberry wine, she'd say things that didn't make sense to me as a child. So 5-638, about how she wasn't allowed in the basement after certain guests had checked out, about stains on linens that Miss Eleanor insisted on washing herself, about smelling something like a butcher shop coming from the kitchen when she arrived early one morning, though Miss Ruth claimed to be preparing a special breakfast. The 56-759, most disturbing was Simmons's recollection of something her grandmother had witnessed in the summer of 1896. Grandmother said she came to work earlier than usual one day and saw Miss Ruth in the garden behind the house. Said she was burying something wrapped in cloth. When grandmother approached, Miss Ruth straightened up quick and said she was just planting new herbs for the kitchen. 57-24, but grandmother said there was a smell and the cloth was stained dark. Miss Ruth gave her an extra $1 that week and told her not to come so early again. Simmons also shared a story her grandmother had told only once on her deathbed in 1932. Grandmother said that once, when cleaning the dining room after a special dinner party, she found what looked like a small bone under the table. So 57-748, not like chicken or beef, more like a finger joint, she said when she showed it to Miss Eleanor, thinking it might be important. Miss Eleanor took it quickly and said it was just part of the special roast. Then Miss Ruth came in from the kitchen and whispered something to Miss Eleanor. They both looked at grandmother in a way that frightened her badly. "Susu 50 let into Devon," she said. Miss Ruth told her, "Some secrets are best kept by those who wish to keep breathing." Grandmother never spoke of it again until she was dying and felt she needed to unburden her soul. Whittaker's research traced a possible connection to 3 women who established a small restaurant in Allentown, Pennsylvania in 1897 under the name Shepherd Sisters. So 5833, the establishment operated for approximately 2 years before closing abruptly following the unexplained death of a patron who, according to local newspaper accounts, took ill suddenly after dining alone at the establishment. The Allentown City Directory from 1897 lists the proprietors of the Shepherd table as Mary Elizabeth and Caroline Shepherd. So 59,000, while the image is not clear enough for positive identification, Whittaker noted in his research journal, the resemblance is striking, particularly in the case of the youngest, who has the same distinctive gaze described by multiple Harpers Ferry residents when speaking of Ruth Blackwood. A review of the Shepherd table, published in the Allentown Morning Call in December 1897, provides an eerie echo of descriptions of the Blackwood house. So 59 and 28, the establishment offers cuisine of remarkable quality, particularly the roasted meats, which achieve a tenderness and flavor that larger restaurants cannot match. A photograph in a local business association publication shows 3 women whose approximate ages align with what the Blackwood sisters would have been at that time. 59 did Fifulers, the 3 sisters who operate the establishment maintain an atmosphere of refined dignity, though some might find the youngest sister's intense observation of diners somewhat disconcerting. Gentlemen dining alone are treated with particular attention and are often invited to sample special dishes not listed on the regular menu. The death that precipitated the restaurant's closure occurred in March 1899. A 101-6, according to police reports uncovered by Whittaker. A businessman named George Harrington was found dead in his hotel room the morning after dining at the Shepherd table. The coroner's report listed the cause as acute gastric distress of unknown origin, though a note in the medical examiner's personal papers suggested possible poisoning cannot be ruled out, though no known toxin presents this particular pattern of symptoms. Lulumludian 100,046. By the time authorities sought to question the Shepherd sisters about Harrington's last meal, they had already closed their restaurant and departed Allentown. A brief notice in the newspaper mentioned only that they had relocated to pursue opportunities elsewhere. No forwarding address was provided. From Allentown, Whittaker followed a trail that led to similar establishments in multiple locations. A 101 Tenders, a boarding house in Rochester, New York, 1900-1902, a small hotel in Cleveland, Ohio, 1903-1905, and a restaurant in Chicago, 1906-1908. In each location, the pattern was consistent. 3 women operating an establishment known for exceptional meals, followed by unexplained disappearances of male patrons, and then sudden closure and relocation. A 1C0-1-36, the Chicago connection proved particularly fruitful for Whittaker's research. City directories listed a restaurant called the Sisters Table, operating on the near north side from 1906 to 1908. The establishment was owned by 3 women who identified themselves as the Shepherd sisters, Mary, Elizabeth, and Caroline, whose ages approximately matched those of the Blackwood sisters if they had assumed new identities. A 1CU206, a review in the Chicago Tribune from December 1906 praised the restaurant's exceptional cuisine, particularly the house specialties of roasts and stews, which the youngest sister reportedly prepares according to old family recipes. The tenderness of the meat is remarkable, achieving a quality that few professional establishments can match. The 102-128, more telling, was an interview with a former waiter at the Sisters Table conducted by Whittaker in 1962. The man, then in his 70s, recalled, "The place was unusual, not like other restaurants where I'd worked. The sisters kept to themselves. The kitchen was strictly off-limits to staff, except for the one busboy they allowed to help with heavy lifting. A 1-2-5-seater, they had a special room in the back that was always locked. Once a week, usually late Tuesday nights, deliveries would arrive. Large ice boxes that the youngest sister would inspect carefully before they were taken to that back room. The waiter continued. There was a private dining room where special guests ate by invitation only. Always men dining alone, usually well-dressed businessmen or travelers. Wonders and 03 wonder threeders, the sisters would serve them personally, no wait staff allowed. Sometimes those gentlemen would look a bit unsteady when leaving, like they'd had too much to drink, though I never saw excessive alcohol being served. The youngest sister, Caroline, they called her, would often help them into cabs, saying they needed assistance returning to their hotels. A 1-3-36, strange thing was, a couple of times guests who left like that came back the next day, looking confused, saying they had no memory of leaving the night before. Chicago police records from 1908 contained a report of an investigation into the disappearance of William Carver, a cattle buyer from Kansas City who was last seen entering the sisters' table for dinner on April 17, 1908. Lie 104403s. The investigation was closed when the restaurant shut down and the proprietors left the city before being questioned. A notation in the file indicates that unusual modifications to the basement area were discovered during inspection of the vacated premises. The investigating officer, Detective Michael Sullivan, added a personal note to the file. The 10426 basement contained custom drainage system and evidence of regular hosing down. Large hooks mounted in ceiling beams. Floor recently covered with new concrete, but core samples taken from several areas show possible blood residue in deeper layers. Neighboring businesses reported unusual garbage disposal practices. Sisters never used regular collection services, but removed trash themselves during late-night hours. A 1-04-154, Sullivan's final comment in the file reads, similar pattern to Rochester and Cleveland cases. Same 3 women, same type of establishment, same customer demographic. Targeted evidence suggests organized, methodical operation rather than crimes of opportunity. Recommend coordination with authorities in previous locations. Those suspect subjects have already relocated beyond our jurisdiction. I-105 Tedland after Chicago, the trail becomes more difficult to follow. Whitaker's notes suggest possible connections to establishments in Detroit, 1909, 1911, Buffalo, 1912, 1914, and finally Pittsburgh, 1915, 1917. In each case, the pattern remained consistent: 3 women, exceptional food, disappearances, and abrupt relocation. EU Hodo 5, 546. The Pittsburgh connection is particularly interesting because it represents the end of the trail. A small restaurant called the Family Table operated in the Oakland neighborhood from 1915 to 1917. City records show it was owned by 3 women who identified themselves as the Wilson sisters, Jane, Anne, and Martha, but whose physical descriptions in business license applications closely match those of the women who had operated the Sisters' Table in Chicago. 1061-7ers in June 1917, the Pittsburgh Press reported on the sudden death of Martha Wilson, the youngest of the sisters, described as the culinary genius whose recipes had made the family table a required destination for those seeking exceptional dining experiences. The cause of death was listed as complications from influenza, though the Spanish flu pandemic had not yet reached Pittsburgh at that time. Of the 106-45, a more revealing account comes from the memoirs of Dr. Errol Jenkins, a Pittsburgh physician who attended Martha Wilson in her final illness. In a privately published volume of recollections, Jenkins wrote, "The case of Miss Wilson remains one of the most disturbing of my career. Her symptoms did not align with any recognized disease process, progressive paralysis, cognitive deterioration, and eventually respiratory failure. A1071 her sisters refused to allow her removal to hospital, insisting on home treatment only. Most curious was their reluctance to allow me to examine her food or medication. The elder sister suggested that Miss Wilson's condition might be the result of occupational exposure to certain chemical compounds used in their culinary business. U10737, I suspect a case of accidental self-poisoning, possibly from substances used in food preservation, though the sisters would not elaborate on their methods. Following Martha's death, the restaurant closed permanently. The two remaining sisters disappeared from public record entirely. A brief item in the Pittsburgh real estate notices indicated that all business assets had been liquidated and the proceeds donated to the Red Cross war effort, as the sisters had returned to their family home in New England. Honolulu 1808, Whittaker's notes speculate that Martha Wilson was in fact Ruth Blackwood and that her death represented the end of the sisters' activities. If the pattern holds, Ruth would have been approximately 54 years old in 1917, relatively young, but consistent with a life of stress and possible exposure to dangerous chemicals used in their activities. A10833, what became of Margaret and Eleanor, if they were indeed the other Wilson sisters, remains unknown. Whittaker's research suggests they may have retired to a small town in Vermont or New Hampshire, using wealth accumulated over decades to live out their lives in anonymous comfort. In March 1968, while examining records in the basement archives of the Chicago Historical Society, Whittaker disappeared. A109 his research materials were found neatly arranged on a table with a half-written note that read only, "I believe I am being." The sentence was never completed. Chicago police conducted a cursory investigation, concluding that Whittaker had likely suffered a medical emergency while working alone and wandered off in a confused state. 921. His body was never found, and the case was classified as a missing person rather than a suspected homicide. This conclusion was reached despite the fact that Whittaker's hat, coat, and briefcase remained at his workspace, and weather records show temperatures well below freezing on the day of his disappearance. A curious footnote to Whittaker's disappearance emerged in 1969 when a clerk at the Historical Society reported finding an unusual item while reorganizing the storage area where Whittaker had been working. As a 109 tucked between two archived ledgers was a small leather-bound notebook that did not belong to the collection. Inside was a list of names and dates spanning from 1893 to 1917 with annotations regarding quality, tenderness, and flavor. The notebook disappeared from the evidence locker at the Chicago Police Department 3 days after it was turned in. Although 121 the clerk who found it reportedly took early retirement and moved to Arizona shortly thereafter. Federal authorities seized Whittaker's research within days of his disappearance. Most of it remains classified with access restricted until 2023. What little has been released provides tantalizing but incomplete glimpses of a case that spans decades and possibly multiple jurisdictions. He147, the few researchers granted limited access to Whittaker's files have emerged with more questions than answers. One such researcher, Dr. Elizabeth Chambers of Columbia University, published a carefully worded paper in 1965, suggesting that the Blackwood case represented a pattern of behavior that may have been repeated in multiple locations across the eastern United States between 1870 and 1915. The one seen levelent in 6Cs, always involving female proprietors of boarding establishments, always targeting male travelers of means, and always characterized by an unusual attention to the culinary experience offered to victims. Chambers' paper stops short of explicit accusations, but strongly implies that the Blackwood sisters, and possibly others, operating with similar methods, were responsible for numerous disappearances spanning decades. L111s and 45, most disturbing is her suggestion that the sisters may have had associates or apprentices who continued their practices long after the original perpetrators would have reached advanced age. This theory gained unexpected support in 1966 when a journalist investigating a series of disappearances in Minneapolis uncovered records of a small restaurant that had operated there from 1920 to 1922. Till 123 years, the establishment called Aunt Martha's Kitchen was run by two elderly women and a much younger third woman who claimed to be their niece. The journalist's work was never published. He suffered a debilitating stroke while conducting research and died without completing his investigation. What truly happened at the Blackwood house remains subject to speculation. Once in 237, the physical evidence has long since disappeared. The sisters themselves, if they lived full lives, would have died before 1950. Any legal reckoning is now impossible. But remains are the fragments, ledgers showing unusual purchases, a guest register with names that match missing persons reports filed in distant cities, a doctor's cryptic journal entry, and the unfinished research of a professor who vanished while attempting to connect these disparate elements. The 113 perhaps most disturbing is the cookbook discovered during renovations to the Blackwood house in 1972. Found sealed within a wall cavity, the handwritten volume contained recipes in Ruth Blackwood's distinctive script. Most were conventional dishes of the period, but several pages had been torn out. A 113 on the inside cover was an inscription, "The secret is in the preparation. Patience yields tenderness. What seems unpalatable can be rendered delicious with proper technique." The cookbook was among the items seized by federal authorities. Its current whereabouts are unknown, though rumors persist that it resides in a special collection at the FBI's Behavioral Science Unit, where it is studied by profilers attempting to understand the psychology of killers who operate across extended time periods and multiple jurisdictions. A single recipe, Elza Wunson 1405, that survived from the cookbook, having been copied by the contractor who discovered it before authorities arrived, offers a disturbing glimpse into Ruth Blackwood's culinary philosophy. Titled simply Special Roast, it contains conventional cooking instructions, but includes a notation. Subject must be properly prepared. A 142-207 soak for minimum of 6 hours in solution described on missing page. The quality of the final result depends entirely on the care taken during preparation and the choice of proper subjects. Those with excessive physical activity produce tough, stringy results. Those with sedentary habits and rich diets yield the most tender portions. The low 114 fills Harpers ears. In the years since Whittaker's disappearance, occasional attempts have been made to reopen investigation into the Blackwood case. Each has met with administrative obstacles or the convenient loss of key documentation. The most recent effort, initiated by a true crime writer in 1966, ended when the author suffered a debilitating stroke before completing his research. A 115s have wonderful local historians in Harpers Ferry now refer to the Blackwood sisters only in passing, usually in the context of businesses that operated in the town during the late 19th century. Tour guides occasionally mention the boarding house as once famous for its fine dining, but omit any reference to the disappearances or subsequent investigations. A 115-35, the building itself has been renovated multiple times. The basement room described in Dr. Fletcher's journal was sealed during renovations in 1923 and remains inaccessible. Current owners report no unusual occurrences, though one former tenant noted in an interview with the Jefferson County Historical Society that the house feels strange at night. The 11600ers, not haunted exactly, more like it's remembering something it doesn't want to share. Park Ranger David Morris, who conducts historical tours of Harpers Ferry, admitted in a 2002 interview that certain aspects of the town's history are deliberately omitted from official narratives. We focus on John Brown's raid, the Civil War, the natural beauty of the area. A once-in-16-724 visitors come for history and scenery, not to hear about the darker chapters. The Blackwood case is something local historians know about, but it's not something we emphasize. Some stories are better left untold. Morris added somewhat reluctantly. There are still people in town whose grandparents or great-grandparents knew the Blackwood sisters. One in 1648, it's not something they like to discuss. There is a sense that whatever happened in that house should stay buried in the past. The current owners of the former Blackwood house, Richard and Susan Thornton, purchased the property in 1998 without knowledge of its history. When interviewed in 2005, Susan Thornton reported, "We found out about the sisters after we'd been living here for about a year. Once in 17 to 12 hours, a neighbor mentioned it casually, as though we should already know. We did some research at the Historical Society, but there wasn't much information available." Richard Thornton added, "We've never experienced anything unusual in the house. Well, except for the garden. Nothing grows in certain spots, no matter what we plant or how we treat the soil, and was 1-17-34, and there's a corner of the basement that always feels colder than the rest of the house, even in summer. But that's probably just poor insulation in an old building." A curious postscript to the Blackwood story emerged in 2009 when renovation work on an old restaurant building in Pittsburgh uncovered a sealed wall cavity containing several glass-preserving jars. The once-in-18 the contents, badly deteriorated after nearly a century, were unidentifiable and were disposed of as biological waste. However, one jar contained a small metal object, a pocket watch with the initials HP engraved on the case. Records indicate the building had once housed the family table restaurant operated by the Wilson sisters in 1917. The watch was claimed by the Pittsburgh Historical Society and remains in their collection. A once-in-1810 tooth, no connection to Howard Phillips, the first documented victim of the Blackwood sisters, has been officially established. The Historical Society's curator noted only that certain artifacts raise more questions than they answer. And perhaps that is as it should be. Perhaps the most appropriate epitaph for the Blackwood case comes from a note found among Professor Whittaker's effects after his disappearance. The once-in-18-5-7 written on the back of a train ticket to Chicago was a single sentence. "The most terrifying aspect of evil is not its monstrosity, but its mundanity. How easily it disguises itself as service, as comfort, as a well-set table with a hot meal waiting." In Harpers Ferry today, visitors walk past the former Blackwood house without a second glance. L1C9 dines in 21. The rivers continue their eternal confluence. The mountains stand silent, witness to secrets long buried. And somewhere perhaps the recipe book of Ruth Blackwood sits in an archive, its missing pages containing instructions never meant to be followed again. For those who research such matters, one curious footnote remains. In cities across the eastern United States between 1897 and 1915, local newspapers occasionally reported on establishments, restaurants, boarding houses, small hotels, where the proprietors were noted for their L129-5-6 exceptional cooking and attentive service. These establishments operated briefly, usually for less than 3 years, before closing without explanation. In each location, the pattern of disappearances continued. Traveling men who were last seen enjoying a hearty meal before vanishing from historical record entirely. The sisters who served more than supper may have disappeared from Harpers Ferry in 1896. But the hunger that drove them may have found new kitchens, new tables, and new guests for many years thereafter. As the final entry in Ruth Blackwood's kitchen ledger noted, when the pantry is empty, it is time to set a new table. And perhaps somewhere in America, that table is being set even now.